Have you ever wondered why you're basically a naked ape? Think about it for a moment. Every other mammal on this planet is covered in a luxurious coat of fur or hair. Bears have thick, insulating pelts. Cats have sleek, protective coats. Even elephants have bristly hair scattered across their massive bodies. But you're sitting there essentially hairless, relying on cotton and polyester to keep you warm. It's actually bizarre when you step back and consider it. We are the only primate that lost almost all of our body hair. And the story of how that happened is far stranger than you might imagine. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if these journeys through humanity's past genuinely speak to you. And if you're listening right now, share your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Now, dim the lights, breathe slowly, and imagine stepping softly into the world of our ancestors. I am about to take you on a journey that spans millions of years across ancient landscapes that no longer exist through evolutionary pressures so intense they literally stripped the hair from our ancestors' bodies. And by the end of this series, you'll understand not just how we became the naked apes we are today, but why this seemingly simple change was actually one of the most important adaptations in human history. But before we dive into the meat of this story, let me give you a preview of what we're about to uncover. First, we're going to explore the moment when our ancestors made a fateful decision that would change everything. Second, we'll discover the brutal environmental pressures that made for a liability rather than an asset. And third, we'll reveal how losing our hair didn't just change how we looked. It fundamentally altered how we think, how we sweat, and even how we love. This isn't just about hair loss. This is about understanding one of the most dramatic transformations in the story of human evolution. Now, I've spent months researching this topic, diving into the latest archaeological findings, genetic studies, and fossil evidence. What I discovered completely changed how I think about human evolution. The traditional story you learned in school, it's incomplete. The real story is far more complex, more dramatic, and more fascinating than anyone ever told you. So, let us begin with a scene that played out roughly 6 million years ago in the forests of Africa. Picture this, a world that looks nothing like the Africa we know today. These ancient landscapes were dominated by dense, humid rainforests stretching as far as the eye could see. The air was thick and moist, filled with the calls of countless species that no longer exist. And moving through these forests were our earliest ancestors, creatures that looked far more like chimpanzees than modern humans. These early hominins, as scientists call them, were covered from head to toe in thick dark hair. Their bodies were perfectly adapted for life in the trees. Long arms for swinging between branches, powerful hands for gripping bark, and that dense coat of fur that protected them from insects, thorns, and the occasional cool night. They lived much like chimpanzees do today, spending their time foraging for fruits, building nests in the canopy, and raising their young in the relative safety of the treetops. But something was about to change. Something that would set in motion a chain of events leading directly to you sitting here watching this video with your peculiarly hairless skin. The first clue to this transformation comes from an unlikely source: the rocks beneath our feet. Geologists studying ancient climate patterns have discovered that around 6 million years ago, the Earth began to cool. This cooling wasn't sudden or dramatic, but it was relentless. Over hundreds of thousands of years, global temperatures dropped, and with them, rainfall patterns shifted across Africa. The dense rainforest that had covered much of the continent began to fragment. Trees that had stood for millennia started to die. Open grasslands began to appear where once there had been only green canopy. This process, known as the Masonian salinity crisis, fundamentally altered the African landscape. Our ancestors found themselves living in an increasingly patchy environment, islands of forest separated by growing expanses of savanna. Now, most primates faced with this challenge simply retreated deeper into the remaining forests. Chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans all chose this path, clinging to their arboreal lifestyle. But one group of early hominins made a different choice. They began to venture out of the trees and onto the ground, exploring these new open spaces that were rapidly expanding around them. This decision would prove to be one of the most momentous in the history of life on Earth, but it came with a price. The very adaptations that had served our ancestors so well in the forest, including that thick coat of protective hair, suddenly became problematic in this new environment. To understand why, we need to talk about thermoregulation. That's the fancy scientific term for how animals control their body temperature. In the cool, shaded forest, fur is an excellent adaptation. It provides insulation, keeping body heat from escaping. It protects against insects and thorns. It even provides some camouflage among the dappled shadows of the canopy. But step out onto the open savanna under the blazing African sun, and suddenly that same fur coat becomes a liability. The problem isn't just the heat, though that's certainly part of it. The real issue is activity level. Forest-dwelling primates can afford to move slowly and deliberately. They can rest in the shade whenever they need to cool down. They can time their activities to avoid the hottest parts of the day. But life on the savanna demanded something different. Our ancestors needed to cover vast distances to find food and water. They needed to outrun predators across open ground. They needed to hunt and gather during the day when visibility was good. And all of this increased activity generated massive amounts of internal heat that had to be dissipated somehow. Here's where the story gets really interesting. Most mammals deal with excess heat through panting like dogs do. But panting has a serious limitation. You can't pant and run at the same time, at least not effectively. Try it yourself. Take a deep breath and start panting like a dog. Now try to have a conversation while you're doing it. You can't. The same principle applies to running. An animal that's panting heavily can't sustain the kind of long distance locomotion that was becoming essential for survival on the African savanna. Our ancestors needed a different solution. They needed a way to cool their bodies that wouldn't interfere with their ability to run, hunt, and communicate. And evolution provided exactly that solution. But it required a radical transformation. They had to lose their fur. The process wasn't immediate. Evolution rarely works that quickly. Instead, over hundreds of thousands of years, individuals with slightly less hair had a survival advantage in this new environment. They could run farther without overheating. They could hunt more effectively during the day. They were more successful at finding mates and raising offspring. Gradually, generation by generation, our ancestors became less and less hairy. But losing fur created new problems that needed to be solved. Without that protective coat, our ancestors' skin was now exposed to harmful ultraviolet radiation from the sun. The solution: their skin began to darken, developing higher concentrations of melanin, the pigment that provides natural sun protection. The solution? Their skin began to darken, developing higher concentrations of melanin, the pigment that provides natural sun protection. This is why early humans in Africa had dark skin, an adaptation that persists in populations that have remained near the equator. The loss of fur also meant losing a layer of protection against insects, thorns, and other environmental hazards. But our ancestors compensated by developing increasingly sophisticated tool use and eventually clothing. They learned to make coverings from animal skins and plant materials, essentially creating artificial fur that they could put on and take off as needed. Perhaps most importantly, losing fur enabled the development of one of humanity's most distinctive features, our extraordinary sweating ability. Humans have more sweat glands per square inch than any other mammal on Earth. We can produce up to 3 L of sweat per hour under extreme conditions. This might not sound impressive until you realize what it means for endurance. A human in good physical condition can literally run down almost any other animal on the planet over long distances. Horses, antelopes, even wolves will eventually overheat and collapse while a determined human can keep going. This ability, known as persistence hunting, became one of our species' most powerful survival strategies. Our ancestors could chase prey animals across the savanna until the animals collapsed from exhaustion, then move in for an easy kill. This hunting strategy required incredible endurance, precise timing, and sophisticated cooperation between group members. It demanded complex communication to coordinate the hunt and share information about animal movements. In other words, losing our fur didn't just change how we looked. It fundamentally altered how we lived, how we worked together, and ultimately how we evolved as a species. But the story doesn't end there. The transition from furry forest dweller to hairless savanna runner created a cascade of other evolutionary changes that would shape every aspect of human development. Our brains began to grow larger, partly to handle the complex cognitive demands of persistence, hunting, and tool use. Our social structures became more sophisticated to support cooperative hunting and child rearing. Even our capacity for language may have been influenced by our ancestors' need to coordinate complex group activities across the open landscape. The loss of fur also had unexpected consequences for human sexuality and pair bonding. Without fur to hide physical development and sexual maturity, visual cues became much more important in mate selection. This may have contributed to the evolution of some uniquely human traits, from our upright posture that displays the body's proportions to the development of prominent secondary sexual characteristics. As we continue this journey through human evolution, we'll explore how these changes rippled through every aspect of our ancestors' lives. We'll discover why some populations retained more body hair than others, how climate continued to shape human appearance as our species spread across the globe, and why understanding our hairless heritage might be crucial for addressing modern health challenges. The transformation from furry forest ape to naked savanna runner represents one of the most dramatic evolutionary transitions in the history of life on Earth. It's a story of environmental pressure, evolutionary innovation, and the power of seemingly small changes to reshape an entire species, and we're just getting started. The transformation we've been discussing wasn't just a simple case of hair falling out and new abilities appearing. The reality is far more intricate, and it involves a discovery that has completely revolutionized how scientists understand human evolution. What I am about to share with you challenges everything we thought we knew about why humans lost their fur. In the 1990s, researchers studying human genetics made a startling discovery. They found that humans possess a broken gene, a genetic mutation that occurred sometime between 3 and 4 million years ago. This gene, when functional, produces a protein called keratin that's essential for growing thick, coarse hair. Every other mammal on Earth has this gene working perfectly, but in humans it's switched off. Now you might think this is just confirmation of what we already suspected. Our ancestors lost their fur, so obviously their hair-growing genes got damaged along the way. But here's the twist that changes everything. This genetic mutation happened before our ancestors left the forests. They were still living in the trees when they lost the ability to grow thick body hair. This discovery has turned the traditional narrative completely upside down. For decades, scientists believed our ancestors lost their fur after they moved to the savanna. But the genetic evidence suggests something far more radical. What if losing our fur wasn't a response to life on the savanna? What if losing our fur is what enabled our ancestors to survive on the savanna in the first place? Think about it this way. Imagine you're one of our early ancestors still living primarily in the trees, but occasionally venturing down to the ground. Suddenly, through a random genetic mutation, you and your offspring cut and grow the thick body hair that has protected your species for millions of years. In the forest canopy, this would normally be a death sentence. You'd be vulnerable to insects, thorns, temperature fluctuations, and countless other hazards. But what if the climate was already changing? What if those forest environments were becoming less stable, less reliable? Suddenly, your apparent disadvantage becomes a hidden superpower, while your fully furred relatives are trapped in the shrinking forests, overheating whenever they try to venture into the expanding grasslands. You can explore these new territories with ease. This is what evolutionary biologists call a pre-adaptation, a trait that evolves for one purpose, but turns out to be incredibly useful for something completely different. Our ancestors didn't lose their fur to adapt to the savanna. They lost their fur first, and then that loss enabled them to conquer the savanna when the opportunity arose. The evidence for this revolutionary timeline keeps mounting. Fossil discoveries in Chad, Ethiopia, and Kenya have revealed that early hominins were already showing signs of reduced body hair coverage much earlier than previously thought. Chemical analysis of ancient soil samples indicates that our ancestors were spending significant time on the ground and in open environments millions of years before scientists originally believed. But perhaps the most compelling evidence comes from studying our closest living relatives, chimpanzees and bonobos, who share about 98.8% of our DNA, still possess the functional version of that hair-growing gene we lost. They can grow thick protective body hair throughout their lives. Yet even they show interesting variations in hair coverage that might give us clues about our own evolutionary journey. In some chimpanzee populations, particularly those living in more open woodland environments rather than dense forests, individuals tend to have slightly less body hair than their forest-dwelling cousins. It's a subtle difference, but it suggests that even our closest relatives face similar evolutionary pressures when they encounter more open environments. This brings us to one of the most fascinating aspects of human hair loss. It wasn't uniform across our entire bodies. We didn't just become completely bald all at once. Instead, we retained hair in very specific locations. And the pattern of what we kept versus what we lost reveals incredible insights into the evolutionary pressures our ancestors faced. Look at your own body for a moment. You still have hair on your head. Obviously, you have eyebrows and eyelashes. You have hair in your armpits and groin area. Men typically develop facial hair and chest hair, but your arms, legs, and torso have only fine, barely visible hair compared to what you'd see on a chimpanzee or gorilla. Each of these patterns tells a story. The hair on your head protects your brain from solar radiation and helps regulate temperature in one of your body's most heat-sensitive organs. Your eyebrows channel sweat away from your eyes during intense physical activity. Your eyelashes protect your eyes from dust and debris. The hair in your armpits and groin areas helps reduce friction during movement and may play a role in trapping and dispersing chemical signals called pheromones. But here's what's really remarkable. The pattern of human hair retention and loss is almost perfectly optimized for long-distance running in hot open environments. It's as if evolution designed our bodies specifically for the kind of persistence hunting our ancestors would later perfect on the African savanna. The more scientists study this phenomenon, the more they realize that human hair loss represents one of the most sophisticated thermoregulatory systems in the animal kingdom. We didn't just randomly lose our fur. We lost it in precisely the right places and retained it in precisely the right places to maximize our cooling efficiency while maintaining protection for our most vulnerable areas. This level of optimization doesn't happen overnight. It requires millions of years of fine-tuning. Countless generations of natural selection favoring individuals with exactly the right balance of hairiness and hairlessness. It suggests that the evolutionary pressures shaping human hair patterns were incredibly consistent and incredibly intense over vast periods of time. Recent research has also revealed that human hair loss involved more than just losing existing hair. Our ancestors actually evolved entirely new types of hair follicles. The fine, nearly invisible hairs that cover most of your body today are in just reduced versions of the thick hair our ancestors once had. They're completely different structures optimized for different functions. These fine body hairs called vellus hairs are incredibly sensitive to air movement and temperature changes. They help your nervous system detect subtle environmental conditions that might affect your body's thermal balance. In essence, your skin has become a sophisticated sensory organ that can detect the slightest changes in wind, temperature, and humidity. This information helps your body make incredibly precise adjustments to blood flow, sweat production, and other cooling mechanisms. This sensory capability would have been invaluable to our ancestors as they learned to navigate the complex thermal environment of the African savanna. They could detect approaching weather changes, find the most comfortable microclimates for rest, and make split-second decisions about when and where to engage in energy-intensive activities like hunting or long-distance travel. The sophistication of human thermoregulation becomes even more apparent when you consider how our sweating system works in coordination with our hairlessness. Unlike most mammals, which have sweat glands primarily on their paw pads or other limited areas, humans have eccrine sweat glands distributed across nearly every inch of skin. These glands can produce sweat that evaporates directly from the skin surface, creating an incredibly efficient cooling system. But this system only works because we lost our fur. Thick hair would trap the sweat close to the skin, preventing evaporation and actually making overheating worse. Our ancestors had to lose their fur before they could develop the extraordinary sweating abilities that would later make them the most successful endurance athletes in the animal kingdom. The coordination between hairlessness and sweating represents one of evolution's most elegant solutions to the problem of thermal regulation during sustained physical activity. It is a system so effective that it allowed our ancestors to thrive in environments that would quickly kill most other primates. As we delve deeper into this evolutionary mystery, we'll discover that losing our fur had consequences that extended far beyond simple temperature control. The naked skin that resulted from this transformation became a canvas for new forms of communication, new types of social bonding, and even new ways of thinking about identity and belonging. But first, we need to understand exactly how this transformation played out across different human populations. As our species spread beyond Africa and encountered entirely new environmental challenges, the story of human hair loss is far from over. In fact, in many ways, it's just beginning. The story becomes even more intriguing when we examine what happened as our ancestors spread beyond the African continent. Because here's something that might surprise you. Not all human populations lost their body hair to the same degree. And the variations we see today tell a fascinating story about adaptation, survival, and the incredible flexibility of human evolution. Around 70,000 years ago, small groups of early humans began migrating out of Africa. These weren't the first attempts, but they were the successful ones that would eventually populate the entire globe. As these groups moved into new territories, they encountered environments that were radically different from the African savanna, where their hairless adaptation had first evolved. Picture the first humans reaching the frigid steppes of Central Asia, or the dense forests of Southeast Asia, or eventually the ice-covered landscapes of Northern Europe. Suddenly, that naked skin that had been such an advantage in the African heat became a serious liability. Without thick fur, How did these populations survive in climates where temperatures could drop far below freezing? The answer reveals another layer of human ingenuity that goes far beyond simple biology. Our ancestors didn't re-evolve their fur. Instead, they invented something better: clothing and fire. They learned to skin animals and wrap themselves in furs that were far superior to anything their own bodies could have produced. They discovered how to control fire, creating portable heat sources that allowed them to survive in environments that would have killed any other tropical primate. But here's where it gets really interesting. Even as these populations developed cultural solutions to cold weather, their bodies continued to adapt in subtle but important ways. Populations that settled in colder climates didn't regrow thick body hair, but they did develop other modifications that helped them survive. For example, populations in Northern Europe and Asia evolved lighter skin pigmentation. This wasn't just about aesthetics. In environments with limited sunlight, lighter skin allowed for more efficient vitamin D synthesis, crucial for bone health and immune function. At the same time, these populations retained slightly more body hair than their African ancestors, particularly on the arms and legs where additional insulation was most beneficial. Meanwhile, populations that remained in hot, sunny climates maintained the dark skin pigmentation that protected against UV radiation, and they actually became even less hairy than their ancestors. Some populations in tropical regions developed skin so efficient at cooling that they could maintain normal body temperature even in conditions that would cause heat stroke in people adapted to cooler climates. The Inuit people of the Arctic represent perhaps the most extreme example of human adaptation to cold environments. Over thousands of years, they developed a suite of biological modifications that helped them survive in one of Earth's most challenging climates. They have a higher metabolic rate that generates more internal heat. They have more brown fat tissue that burns calories specifically for warmth. They have modified blood vessels that prevent frostbite in extremities, but notice what they didn't develop: thick body hair like a polar bear or Arctic fox. Even in the most extreme cold, humans remained fundamentally naked apes who relied on technology and behavioral adaptations rather than biological ones to stay warm. This pattern holds true across all human populations. From the Australian Aborigines who survived in desert conditions to the mountain peoples of Tibet who adapted to high-altitude environments, humans consistently chose technological and cultural solutions over biological ones. We remained the naked ape, but we became incredibly creative about compensating for our nakedness. This flexibility may actually represent one of humanity's greatest evolutionary advantages. While other species are locked into specific biological adaptations that work well in particular environments, humans developed the ability to rapidly adapt to new conditions through learning and innovation rather than waiting for genetic changes to occur over thousands of generations. Consider what this means for the speed of human expansion across the globe. A population of early humans could encounter a completely new environment and within a few generations develop the cultural knowledge needed to thrive there. They could learn to make appropriate clothing, find suitable shelter, identify local food sources, and develop hunting or gathering strategies tailored to local conditions. This cultural adaptability was directly enabled by our hairless skin. The loss of fur didn't just make us better runners and hunters. It made us more dependent on technology and cooperation, which in turn drove the development of larger brains, more complex language, and more sophisticated social structures. Think about it this way. A chimpanzee can survive quite comfortably with minimal technology because its fur provides built-in protection against weather, insects, and minor injuries. But a naked human in the same environment would need tools to build shelter, clothing for protection, and weapons for hunting. They would need to cooperate with others to share knowledge about tool-making, food preparation, and survival strategies. This dependence on technology and cooperation created a feedback loop that accelerated human cognitive evolution. The more dependent our ancestors became on cultural solutions, the more advantage there was to having larger brains capable of learning, remembering, and innovating. Groups with better problem-solving abilities were more likely to survive and reproduce, passing on both their genes and their knowledge to the next generation. Recent Archaeological discoveries have provided stunning evidence of just how quickly human technology evolved after we lost our fur. Sites in Africa dating back over 100,000 years show evidence of sophisticated clothing production, advanced tool manufacturing, and even early forms of art and symbolic communication. The Blombos Cave in South Africa contains artifacts that demonstrate our ancestors were creating complex tools, jewelry, and even abstract art over 75,000 years ago. These weren't simple survival technologies. They represent sophisticated cultural expressions that required advanced planning, artistic vision, and the ability to think abstractly about concepts like beauty and meaning. But perhaps the most remarkable discovery comes from genetic studies of ancient human populations. Scientists have found that the genes controlling human brain size and cognitive function underwent rapid evolutionary changes during the same period when our ancestors were spreading across the globe and developing increasingly complex technologies. This suggests that losing our fur didn't just enable technological development. It actually drove accelerated brain evolution by creating survival pressures that favored intelligence, creativity, and social cooperation over physical adaptations. The implications of this are staggering. Every major human achievement from language and art to agriculture and space exploration can be traced back to the evolutionary cascade that began when our ancestors lost their body hair. Our nakedness didn't just change how we looked. It fundamentally altered the trajectory of life on Earth. Here at Ancestor Vault, we're always amazed by these connections between seemingly small evolutionary changes and massive historical consequences. The loss of body hair might seem like a minor detail in the grand story of human evolution, but as we're discovering, it was actually one of the most consequential adaptations in the history of our species. But we're still not done with this story because that's another aspect of human hair loss that researchers have only recently begun to understand. And it involves one of the most intimate aspects of human biology, our reproductive and social behaviors. You see, losing our fur didn't just affect how we regulated temperature or developed technology. It completely transformed how humans select mates, form pair bonds, and raise children. And these changes may have been just as important as the cognitive developments we've been discussing. When our ancestors lost their thick body hair, they became the only primate species where physical development and sexual maturity were clearly visible from a distance. This created entirely new dynamics in mate selection and social hierarchy that continue to influence human behavior today. Unlike other primates where thick fur obscures body shape and development, naked humans could easily assess each other's age, health, and reproductive status through visual cues alone. This led to the evolution of more prominent secondary sexual characteristics and more complex mating behaviors than we see in any other primate species. The social implications were equally dramatic. In a world where physical appearance was suddenly much more visible and important, our ancestors had to develop new forms of social organization, new ways of signaling status and belonging, and new methods of resolving conflicts without the physical dominance displays that work for fur-covered primates. Some researchers believe that the development of complex language, artistic expression, and even early forms of clothing and body decoration all emerged as responses to the social challenges created by our naked skin. We had to learn to communicate in more sophisticated ways because the simple physical displays that other primates used were no longer sufficient for managing complex social relationships. This transformation continues to influence human society today in ways most people never consider. Our obsession with clothing, fashion, and physical appearance, our complex rituals around dating and marriage, even our tendency to form large cooperative societies rather than small family groups like most other primates. All of these behaviors can be traced back to the evolutionary pressures created when our ancestors first lost their protective coat of fur. As we continue to unravel this story, we'll explore how these social and reproductive changes interacted with the cognitive developments we discussed to create the unique creature that is modern humanity. We'll discover why some aspects of human hair loss are still evolving today and why understanding our hairless heritage might hold keys to addressing some of the most pressing challenges facing our species in the modern world. The journey from furry forest ape to naked technological genius is far from over. In fact, as we'll see in the next part of our exploration, some of the most dramatic chapters in this story are still being written by evolutionary pressures that continue to shape human populations today. The evolutionary pressures that shaped our hairless bodies didn't stop when humans spread across the globe. In fact, some of the most fascinating aspects of human hair loss are still actively evolving today, right under our noses. And what scientists have discovered about ongoing human evolution challenges everything we thought we knew about how quickly our species can adapt. Let's start with something you can observe in your own family. Have you ever noticed that your grandparents might be slightly hairier than your parents, and your parents slightly hairier than you? This isn't just your imagination. Human populations across the globe are continuing to lose body hair at measurable rates. Even in the modern era, researchers studying historical records and photographs from the past century have documented a consistent trend toward reduced body hair coverage in most human populations. The change is subtle, happening over generations rather than within individual lifetimes, but it's statistically significant and appears to be accelerating. Why would this process continue today when we no longer face the survival pressures that originally drove human hair loss? The answer lies in a concept called sexual selection. Even though we no longer need to run down prey animals on the African savanna, humans in most cultures continue to prefer mates with less body hair. This preference varies between cultures and has changed over time, but the overall trend has consistently favored reduced hairiness. This ongoing evolution reveals something profound about how human biology continues to be shaped by social and cultural factors. We're not just passive recipients of our evolutionary heritage. We're actively participating in our own evolutionary future through the choices we make about mates, lifestyle, and even medical interventions. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. While most human populations are becoming less hairy over time, some isolated groups are actually evolving in the opposite direction. The Ainu people of Japan, certain populations in the Caucasus Mountains, and some Aboriginal Australian groups have maintained or even increased their body hair coverage over the past several thousand years. These populations provide crucial insights into the environmental and social factors that continue to influence human evolution.